As we approach the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we're putting more focus on America's foundational documents. But one of those, the Articles of Association, seems to be very nearly forgotten, even though it explains perhaps better than any of the others the political and economic factors that were driving the American colonies to rebel. The Articles of Association were passed by the First Continental Congress on October 20th, 1774, 250 years ago today, and while often overlooked, they are a critical part of the story and a window into the colonial mind of what would lead the colonies into open rebellion. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5th, 1774. The purpose of the Congress, which included representatives of 12 of the original 13 colonies, with Georgia not sending representatives, was to address grievances that had arisen over colonial administration. Those grievances had both spurred the December 1773 Boston Tea Party and had been exacerbated by the response by the British government to that event. The Congress didn't call for independence, but rather for measures to resolve ongoing disputes. The primary goal was to seek repeal of what were called in the United Kingdom the Coercive Acts, and in the United States called the Intolerable Acts. These were a series of 4 acts intended to punish Massachusetts colonists for the defiance of Crown authority evidenced in the Boston Tea Party. The Congress issued a petition to the King and passed a declaration and resolves of the First Continental Congress. Passed on October 14th, the declaration was essentially a list of colonial grievances. Passed 4 days later, the Articles of Association represented an agreement among the colonies to an economic boycott intended to pressure Parliament and the King into addressing the colonies' concerns. The call for boycott was not at all new, but organized economic resistance required agreement, as the Office of the Historian of the United States Congress explains. Merchant communities were reluctant to participate in such a boycott unless they were mutually agreed upon terms and a means to enforce the boycott's provisions. Boycott required unity. This is in itself significant. While there was unrest in many places in the colonies, there had previously been little unity of cause. The First Continental Congress represented an early attempt to coordinate a colonial response to grievances, but it was the need for agreement in order to enforce boycott, which at the time was really the only way for the colonies to pressure Parliament and the King, that transformed the disparate complaints into a unified cause. The Continental Association was not only important for the boycott that it desired, but because it represented an actual association, perhaps the first nascent example of a United States of America. The Continental Association was intended as an economic sanction, much as nations still use today to try to compel the behaviors of other nations. But the details in this lesser-known document of the Revolution are very telling as to the true drivers of the Patriots' cause, even though the goal at the time was far short of revolution. In fact, the very first words of the document are, "We, His Majesty's most loyal subjects," and it avowed our allegiance to His Majesty, our affection and regard for our fellow subjects in Great Britain and elsewhere. The association was presented in the form of 14 agreements that the inhabitants of the several colonies whom we represent firmly agree and associate under the sacred ties of virtue, honor, and love of our country. The first agreement was the boycott itself, an agreement not to import any goods, wares, or merchandise whatsoever from Great Britain or Ireland, as well as goods from elsewhere in the empire, beginning on the 1st of December. The association specified some goods to apparently both make their boycott explicit and to demonstrate to the Crown the potential economic impact. Notably, in the third agreement, from this day we will not purchase or use any tea imported on account of the East India Company. This was, of course, a reference to the Boston Tea Party and an opposition to attack specifically on tea, and a complaint that the Crown had given the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales to the American colonies. But there was another intent here. Britain was desperate to sell the East India Company's tea. While the British East India Company was a private company, it was hugely indebted to the British government. The company was facing a crisis on multiple levels, including political turmoil in India, an overvaluation of company stock that resulted in a financial crash in 1769, and a global reduction in the demand for the company's most important export product, tea. The company had a glut of both debt and tea, and the Crown, to save the company and protect the debt the company owed to it, really needed to sell that tea. The Boston Tea Party is generally seen as a tax protest, a complaint that the British attempt to ditch cheap Indian tea in America was a ruse to get the colonies to accept the Townshend duties. But there was more to it. The tea was of particular economic importance to the empire. part of the empire that the British likely valued even more than the American colonies themselves. The Tea Party and the boycott of East India Company tea was not just a tax protest, but economic warfare based on the understanding that America was part of a broader empire and could economically damage that empire. We were kicking George III right in the tea kettle, where we knew it would hurt. A more peculiar list is given in Agreement 8, which essentially banned entertainment, from shows and plays to horse racing and cockfighting to buying nice clothes for a funeral. There were multiple motives here, including portraying British culture as frivolous and corrupt, but there was also the motive of simply being frugal, an agreement that frugality was needed to endure the boycott of British goods. The fourth agreement was, if issues were not resolved, to likewise refuse to export goods or commodities to Great Britain or Ireland. However, in the earnest desire we have not to injure our fellow subjects in Great Britain, Ireland, or the West Indies, the restriction on exports would not begin until 10 September 1775. So why the gap between banning imports and banning exports? Well, on face there was a selfish reason. While both bans would hurt the colonies as well as the crown, banning imports would obviously hurt British merchants more, while banning exports would deny American merchants business. But the difference reaches to something more fundamental. The association had goals beyond the repeal of the intolerable acts, among them to allow the colonies to develop an economy less dependent on Great Britain. In fact, the Continental Association was based on a series of agreements made in Virginia 5 years previously called the Virginia Association. These agreements were presented as an economic sanction against a set of taxes imposed by Britain called the Townshend Duties, but they had a deeper motive. George Washington, a large plantation owner who had served in the British Army during the French and Indian War, originally proposed the idea to fellow planter George Mason. The resolves, principally written by Mason, were introduced into the Virginia House of Burgesses by Washington. In many ways, the resolves were no surprise. They argued against the Townshend Duties and suggestion by the king that American citizens could be taken to Britain for trial. The boycott was not described as an attempt to injure the empire so much as an attempt to demonstrate to the crown the economic importance of Virginia. But left out of the document, another point was argued before the House of Burgesses. Washington argued that the boycott might actually be beneficial to the American economy, or at least that the benefits would outweigh the costs. At issue was the lack of colonial manufacturing. The issue had become more acute because there had been a series of poor harvests in Virginia, but also because of price fluctuations in their most important cash crop, tobacco. This had caused suffering among the planter class, which was then exacerbated by the new taxation. In the boycott, Washington and Mason saw an opportunity to reduce dependence upon British manufactured goods, thus encouraging the development of domestic manufacturing and diversifying the economy. The goal of boycott was not just to pressure the British government over policy, but also to help the development of local industry. And this ties to one of the most surprising agreements in the Continental Association, brought over from the Virginia Association. The second agreement, that we will neither import nor purchase any slave. Part of this was purely economic coercion. The importation of enslaved people from Africa was an important business in the United Kingdom and critical to the operation of plantations in other British colonies. Part was probably political, an attempt to shift moral responsibility for the trade to the British. But a significant motivation was diversification of the American economy. Historian Bruce Ragsdale explained in his 1996 book, A Planter Republic, The Search for Economic Independence in Revolutionary Virginia, reduced tobacco cultivation and an end to slave purchases would provide the capital and labor to the development of home manufacturers and induce British manufacturers to settle in Virginia. To Washington, the importation of slaves contributed to the dependence of Virginia on the tobacco trade, preventing the economy from diversifying. The idea that the association was not just an economic boycott, but an attempt to diversify the American economy was further illustrated in the seventh agreement. We will use our utmost endeavors to improve the breed of sheep and increase their number to the greatest extent. The U.S. was dependent upon English wool, and the agreement, which banned the sale of U.S. sheep to foreign entities and tried to kill them as sparingly as may be, was clearly designed not so much to harm Britain economically as to develop American industry. While many of the 14 agreements were designed around enforcing the boycott, the 14th agreement, and we do further agree and resolve that we will have no trade, commerce, dealings, or intercourse whatsoever with any colony or province in North America which shall not accede to, or which shall not hereafter violate, this association. It's very important. Put simply, any of the American colonies who did not fully participate in the boycott would face boycott of its own. This was a practical necessity. The Virginia Association had largely failed because some merchants refused to participate. But while the Continental Association demonstrated that the original complaint was based on practical economic goals, it was the need for unity in order to make economic sanctions effective that brought together the American cause. The British response would further galvanize colonial opposition, but it was this drive for unity that would slowly transform economic grievances into a revolutionary cause. Broader ideals such as taxation without representation and the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. They weren't so much its original cause, but the result of the response to much more practical and less idealistic economic concerns, which itself uncovers another truth. We tend to see the American Revolution in local terms, but it was largely the result of world events. Between 1756 and 1763, there had been a global conflict of empire called the 7 Years' War. The American theater of the war had been the French and Indian War, in which American colonists and British redcoats had fought side by side. The war had resulted in victory for Britain around the world, but particularly in North America, where Britain had acquired control of Canada. But the victory came at great cost. The British government was left with a massive amount of debt, the greatest in its history. Meanwhile, the American colonies faced a significant recession following the war, owing to the sudden decrease of wartime demand. That taxes had become such a bone of contention was largely a British attempt to recoup costs and pay debts. But Americans were in a poor position to pay more, and the taxes exacerbated the already difficult economic conditions. But there was more. Freedom from global war allowed the British to more strictly enforce tariffs and restriction of foreign trade that had been previously largely ignored. American merchants were faced with the double whammy of decreased trade due to the end of the war and greater restriction on tradability. The debt caused stress upon the economic system, uncovering flaws in the British banking system, which then resulted in a financial collapse in London in 1772 that spread around the continent. The debt drove further banking regulations in the United Kingdom that then impacted the ability for British firms to advance credit to Americans, something that notably affected trade in cotton in the South. As the economy tightened in England in response to the debt, banks called in debts, but American businessmen, especially in the South, lacked hard currency, their wealth tied up in land and enslaved people. This not only disrupted trade, it caused more economic hardship and thus more resistance to taxation. In London, bank collapses and bankruptcies dramatically increased, putting more financial strain on the system. What has been described as the world's first international credit crisis caused recession, which among other things caused a decrease in the world demand for tea. In many ways, the grievances that drove resistance in America were part of a broader, worldwide economic downturn. As a final note, the Continental Congress had rejected a compromise, the Plan of Union offered by Pennsylvanian Joseph Galloway. The plan would essentially have created a subordinate American parliament called the Grand Council. It isn't clear if Britain would have accepted such a proposal, but the Continental Congress did not, tabling the motion and choosing the more radical move of economic boycott. Galloway and other moderates were disappointed. Galloway so much so that he would side with the British as a loyalist following the Declaration of Independence and finally relocate to Great Britain. That is to say, even His Majesty's most loyal subjects were already drawing the lines between patriot and loyalist, that civil war that was also part of the war for independence. The forces that drove America into revolution were far more complex than give me liberty or give me death. As we consider our foundational documents, the Articles of Association should be remembered alongside the Declaration of Independence. They shouldn't be forgotten. They remind us that our original cause was much more economic and practical than it was idealistic and philosophical. They show us that America was as interested in developing its own economy as it was in fighting taxation. They help us understand the revolutionary cause in the context of broader world events rather than just as a local political issue. And they show us how the disparate colonies were first brought together to eventually become states united. And they raise an interesting question. Was revolution already inevitable? I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.